So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. What an honor and a privilege to be here, to be able to talk to you about building ethical AI. And so my plan in doing this is to talk a little bit about ethical AI and then move on to some of the ways that people are trying to tackle building ethical AI as we are doing at the World Economic Forum. And so let me start by giving you this rather trite phrase. We hear it all the time. Technology does not determine the future, we do. And yet it seems, doesn't it, as if technology is romping to the final finishing post and we're all running behind somewhere over here. And so how can we build ethical AI so that we can bring the benefits of technology to all of us? Well, let's talk about building ethical AI to do so. So, I don't take the view that AI is just another tool, like the hammer, for example, because it's actually much more complex than a hammer. You don't, and you've just heard, I think, a whole panel of people talking about the ways that AI might go wrong. So I'd like to compare AI not to a hammer, not to an ordinary tool, maybe like a gun, but perhaps more to a car. So let's think about the car. You have good, well-meaning engineers trying to design a car that keeps us all safe. The same with many people who are building AI. But you've only got to get one or two components in that car go wrong, and you can have an almighty mess and a crash that kills people. The same with if you get something wrong when you're building AI, or if you use the biased data sets, or you'll just come from a particular population sample as an engineer, and that means that you get something wrong and you put in your own biases into the tool that you're building. And then on the other side of the car and the AI, in my example, you have those customers, those users. And so however safely you might have built your tool, you can never be sure that somebody's not going to come along and drive your car really badly and crash it. So let's then think about an AI example of that. Tay. Nobody thinks that the designers ever expected what happened with Tay, but once it got involved in that environment with those people, we found that it went wrong. And so, when we're thinking about building ethical AI, we need to be thinking about these things: bias, transparency, accountability, and privacy. Because if we don't, if we continue to build tools that catch the headlines like Cambridge Analytica, then we're destroying trust in our industry. And without trust, we are not going to be able to move on and harness the huge benefits that we know AI has waiting for us if we can get it right. So, at the World Economic Forum, what we've been thinking about is this. Agile governance as a way of building ethical AI. So, making sure that we think about governance that is adaptive. That's that horse already bolted from the stable that I talked about earlier. Let's be adaptive so that we can regulate something that's complex and moving. And when I use the word regulation, I don't mean government. I mean all these different types of agile governance strategies that I'm going to talk to you about. Let's make our governance human-centered, because AI should be there to help us, not to take over, as some of those comments in the earlier panel. Also, any governance mechanism to actually work has to be inclusive. If you don't get people to join with you, then you are not going to have a good governance mechanism. And let's make this sustainable policy. As I say, if we don't get people to join with us, then we are not going to have good governance. So these governance measures have to be multi-stakeholder. They have to include governments, business, civil society, and academia. They have to rapidly navigate change and respond to the change of the technology. And then they need to embrace change, and we need to be able to take those learnings and reiterate our governance models. So what types of agile governance am I actually talking about? Well, the development and use of standards. I've been privileged to work with the IEEE for the last 3 years on thinking about ethical standards for the work that we working in AI do, so things around accountability and transparency. As a lawyer, I'm really interested in those sort of things, because when we start to have, for example, autonomous vehicle accidents, as we have seen, we lawyers need to know how to deal with these sort of things in court. The forum that I work for has also been working on protocols around how IoT systems work together and how insurers might insure some of those devices. We've seen social norms. We've seen a vast amount of discussion about governance in the papers. So we've seen social norms begin to develop. Private incentive schemes, certification. I will come back to that later, because one of the projects that I'm doing at the forum applies to that. Oversight by professional bodies. Well, obviously, the IEEE is one of those, but also we could think, for example, of the ethical guidelines that ACM produced last year. And then industry agreements. We have seen amongst Google and Microsoft, for example, internal guidelines about the use of AI. We've also seen something called the Partnership on AI, thinking about these ethical issues and how you build ethical AI. So how our industry polices itself and how our industry moves forward with some of these initiatives are really important. So you may have read Andrew Ng's piece that said every company will need a chief AI officer. And you may also have read my companion piece, which says, and they need to think about ethical AI. So DeepMind does this really well. They have an internal ethics advisory panel, and they have an external health panel thinking about ethics and AI and healthcare. So let me just tell you a little bit about the work that I'm doing at the World Economic Forum, which I think will help to explain some of these mechanisms that I've been talking about. And let me first explain that a project is 3 months in the thinking about, 9 months in the co-creation, a multi-stakeholder process, because as I say, to do good governance, you need everyone involved, and then 6 months piloting. So if a government is doing a project with us at the World Economic Forum, that government will pilot the project that we have all worked on together. And all projects need to have, as a cross-cutting theme, ethics and values, social inclusion, humans at the center of everything that we do, and be designed for the benefit of humanity as a whole. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is that it's very easy to sit here in San Francisco talking about AI, but let's make sure that we sit in places around the world and talk about AI as well, and the benefits it can bring. So to do a project, what we do is we bring in fellows from academia, civil society, business, and government to co-create these projects. And let me just talk about the projects very briefly. So the first one is what we call Unlocking Public Sector AI. The goal of this is that we will work with the governments that are engaged on this to co-create ethical guidelines and standards. They will then use that tool, and they will use the tool to measure the validity of all artificial intelligence that they buy in or create in-house. Now, if you're talking about building ethical AI, and obviously these standards and guidelines will have an ethical component to them, if you can get a government to sign up to do this, then you are affecting a large amount of artificial intelligence and therefore building it ethically. It also allows those governments to say, this is a line in the sand. This is where we think that everybody in our jurisdiction should be building artificial intelligence, ethical artificial intelligence too. And so it actually affects the entire community of those people who are buying AI and those people who are selling AI in that jurisdiction. And we have governments in Europe and in Africa and in Oceania who are engaged in this project. The other side of building ethical AI is to help companies to see that it's really important for their brand to build AI ethically. And one of the things that we noticed when we were looking at AI is that there are a whole lot of traditional companies who are really frightened or worried about spending R&D dollars on creating AI or buying it in because they don't know what the government's tolerance level is. That's the other project, which hopefully we will help solve, but also don't know enough about what this thing called AI is. They're told to get AI, but they have no idea what they're doing. And so this project is to help more companies buy AI and benefit from the great benefits that AI can bring to their company. So it helps boards to understand what AI is, what its benefits are, what might be the problems, and how to deal with those. We then have 3 other projects out of San Francisco, but I should say at this stage that we also have an office in Japan, an office in Beijing, and are soon to open one in Mumbai, and will have other centers for the 4th Industrial Revolution around the world within the next year. And so there are other projects which will be run out of China and India in the AI space. So another trite saying that we come across all the time is regulation impedes innovation, or regulation stifles innovation. So this third project is really about how do we tackle that? How do we let the regulator do their job of protecting us, the citizens, whilst also ensuring that AI grows and develops for the benefit of everybody. And so I said I'd come back to certification. This is a possible way. Can we find a way that regulators can work with companies and certify product rather than the current way that regulators work? And can they do that in an agile, fast way so that it meets the needs of those of you who are producing artificial intelligence products? The one in the middle was suggested to me by the Global Futures Council of the World Economic Forum on AI and robotics. And they said what we really need if we're going to build ethical AI is to ensure that all students coming out of university have had some training about the impact of their work on society. And so we thought about this, and we came up with this idea that the World Economic Forum would host curricula that professors have already built with that social impact piece in it. And then we would invite other professors from around the world to take those curricula, modify them so that they are culturally relevant to them, because we don't want to dictate our ethical position to anybody. And then all we ask in return is that those professors put their amended syllabi or curricula back into the repository for the use of others. So what we're hoping is that instead of having someone like Chris Wiley saying to the Guardian, well, I was 24 and it seemed like a really good idea at the time, we will have scientists coming out of college who actually understand social impact in a deep and meaningful way in terms of their work. And then also on the panel that you've just heard, they were talking about the fact that we would have AI personal assistants and possibly robot companions in the future. So Generation AI is a project that thinks about what that might look like. So let's think about your 2-year-old or your child who is just beginning to talk. Normally, or at least when I was young, what we did was we had tea parties, for example. This is probably more than you need to know about me, but I'm going to share it anyway. So one would have tea parties, and you would make up backstories for all of the people who were at your tea party, all of your stuffed toys or whatever it was that you were playing with. And all of you know that whether it was a toy that shot guns, or whether it was a doll, or whether it was a stuffed toy, all of you will remember making up those backstories. If you have an AI-enabled toy, the child won't have to make up those backstories because the AI-enabled toy will automatically begin to talk to it. You can have a situation where there are lots of AI-enabled toys all talking to one another and to the child. Does that change how we develop as humans? Does it change our creativity? We don't know, and we really feel that we should probably find out before we move to what, to my mind, is one of the hugest benefits of AI, and that is using AI to personalize education. What happens to our children's data if it's being kept or collected from the first time they start to speak? Who looks after that data? Is it held by commercial companies? Is there some other way of looking after the data? Those are very important issues when you see what Cambridge Analytica was able to do with just a survey. So we need to think about protecting our children whilst also advancing the huge benefits of AI in the education space. So I've talked a bit about the work that we've been doing and others have been doing around building ethical AI. And you might say, well, who's making sure that they're behaving ethically? And these projects are ethically designed. So the forum is creating something that we call the Global AI Council. And it, too, will be a multi-stakeholder entity at high levels. So, for example, Theresa May, who's the Prime Minister of the UK, has agreed to serve on this council. It will deal with AI governance and implications across the globe of AI and governance measures. And it will guide the work that I do through the various offices of the World Economic Forum around the world. And its first meeting to strategize is in China next month. So we've talked a lot about AI, building ethical AI. But the question is really this one, isn't it? How can we ensure that AI and machine learning serve the whole world and benefit everyone? Let's unpick this a little bit. You may have read Mustafa Suleyman, who is one of the co-founders of DeepMind. He wrote an article recently in which he said, why is it that some of the best minds on the planet are concentrating on building AI that sells soft drinks better and more often, when there are so many people on our planet that actually don't have access to clean water? So at Singularity University, we should really be thinking about that. There will be people from VC companies in the audience, and also many of you who are in startups. Is your startup to make a lot of money? Or is your startup to make a difference and make sure that everybody benefits from AI around the world? And I want to give you a very quick example from a different team at the World Economic Forum. And that's our drones team. So a country called Rwanda, which is in Africa, is very mountainous. And they were having a lot of women who were dying for lack of blood when they were giving birth to their children. They wanted to do drone delivery of that blood because they have little infrastructure, and this would be a really good way of solving this problem. But of course, once you start to think about flying drones, you also encounter airspace generally and planes. So my colleagues at the World Economic Forum in the drone team worked with Rwanda and the other stakeholders, a multi-stakeholder process, to help create regulation that now enables women in Rwanda not to die from loss of blood. And they created a template, which is what all of our projects will do, which can be used by other countries around the world. Now, why do I bring this up when I'm talking about startups and VCs? Well, actually, because one of those companies was a company called Zipline. They're a company that was started by two Americans. But they went to Rwanda to work because it was too difficult to do this work here in America. Now, as a result of the success of this work in Rwanda, they're able to move operations all around the world. So don't think that your startup actually has to be based here in order to be successful. It could be based somewhere else, and it could be solving this problem of how we make everybody else benefit, how we ensure everybody else benefits from the huge potential of artificial intelligence. And in fact, just as a side note, Rwanda now has a better maternal health rate in terms of women not dying in childbirth than a number of rural areas in America. Something to think about. So, in conclusion, I ask you to think about making sure that when you're working on AI, you build ethical AI, you think about these governance mechanisms, and we ensure that we spread the benefit of AI globally. Thank you very much.